40 professional fights, 40 knockouts. That was the number hanging over Wembley Arena before a single punch had been thrown. Artur Beterbiev did not walk to the ring like a man defending belts. He walked like a force of nature collecting what already belonged to him. Unified champion, pound-for-pound menace. A man nobody outboxed, nobody outlasted, and nobody survived. Across from him stood Anthony Yarde, a fighter many respected for his athleticism, but doubted at the very highest level. This was supposed to be another entry in Beterbiev's highlight reel, another night where inevitability crushed ambition. But boxing has always lived in the space between expectation and belief, and Yarde entered the ring carrying something dangerous, calm. No wild eyes, no nervous energy, just focus. From the opening bell, the crowd felt it. This wasn't a man there to last. This was a man there to test something sacred. The first jab snapped out, and suddenly the rhythm felt wrong. Beterbiev came forward as he always did, heavy boots, steady pressure, but he was being touched. Not hurt, not panicked, but interrupted. Yarde's lead hand found space. His left hook whispered warnings. For the first time in years, the champion had to think. And when a fighter like Beterbiev is forced to think, something rare happens, hope creeps in. The audience leaned forward, not because a knockout was coming, but because something unfamiliar was unfolding. The monster wasn't roaring yet, and in boxing, silence before violence is often the most dangerous sound of all. As the rounds settled, Anthony Yarde began doing the unthinkable. He stayed composed. He didn't rush greatness. He didn't chase headlines. He boxed. The jab kept touching. The left hook kept finding Beterbiev stepping in just a fraction too square. The champion pressed forward as he always does, but now there were moments, brief, fragile moments, where his feet paused. Cuts began to show. Marks formed. Evidence. Every time Yarde landed clean, Wembley erupted louder, feeding belief into his veins. This wasn't reckless courage. This was controlled defiance. Beterbiev responded, of course. He always does. Heavy shots began thudding into Yarde's guard, sneaking through, reminding him of the tax required to stand in front of a man like this. Yarde felt it. You could see it in his breathing, in the way he reset his feet after exchanges. But he didn't break, and that's what changed the fight. Because champions are built on opponents breaking. When they don't, doubt starts asking questions. The middle rounds became a brutal exchange of intent. Not just punches, but statements. Yarde was saying he belonged. Beterbiev was reminding him who ruled here. Momentum swung back and forth violently, like a pendulum powered by pain. Each time it looked like Yarde might fade, he answered with another sharp hook, another body shot, another roar from the crowd. And for the first time in his professional career, Artur Beterbiev was being forced into something deeper than domination. He was being forced into a fight. By the 5th and 6th rounds, the fight transformed into something raw. Faces were marked. Breath was labored. The clean narrative of champion versus challenger dissolved into chaos. Yarde hurt Beterbiev, truly hurt him. The champion stepped back just for a moment, and that moment shook the arena. This wasn't supposed to happen. Beterbiev bleeding, retreating, absorbing. These were images the boxing world wasn't used to seeing. Yarde sensed it. He pressed forward, pouring punches, driven by instinct and adrenaline, chasing the biggest moment of his life. But here is where boxing reveals its cruel truth. Hurt champions are still champions. Experience whispers when panic screams. Beterbiev didn't run, he waited. He absorbed. He calculated. Even as Yarde landed, even as the crowd believed, the champion stored energy like a storm waiting to break. The exchanges became savage. Uppercuts, hooks, body shots, both men biting down on their mouthguards, refusing to yield. This wasn't about belts anymore. This was about pride. And in that furnace, Yarde proved something undeniable. He wasn't surviving. He was competing. He was forcing greatness to answer him punch for punch. But greatness, when cornered, doesn't flee. It adapts. And slowly, subtly, the tide began to demand its payment. Courage is expensive in boxing, and by the 7th round, the bill was coming due. Anthony Yarde's mouth hung open between exchanges. His legs responded just a fraction slower. The punches still came, but the snap had dulled. Beterbiev noticed. This is where monsters earn their reputation. The pressure intensified. The shots grew heavier. The rhythm shifted back into something familiar, the champion walking a man down. Yarde still fired back, still found moments, still earned the crowd's love with every exchange, but the margins were shrinking. Every mistake now carried consequence. Every second on the ropes became dangerous. And then it happened. A thunderous shot crashed through Yarde's defenses, sending him to the canvas. The arena froze. He rose, fueled by heart, by pride, by refusal. But boxing is unforgiving. The follow-up was merciless. Beterbiev poured it on, not out of anger, but necessity. This is how champions survive challenges, by extinguishing them completely. Yarde's corner saw what bravery couldn't fix. They made the call. The fight was stopped. Silence followed, then thunderous applause. Not for the winner alone, but for the war that had just been waged. When it was over, Artur Beterbiev stood bloodied but victorious, belt still wrapped around his waist, his aura intact, perhaps even strengthened, because dominance means more when it's tested. And Anthony Yarde, though defeated, left the ring with something rarer than a title: respect. He forced a champion into deep waters. He answered every question ever asked about his heart, his toughness, his belonging at the elite level. This fight didn't damage Yarde's reputation, it built it. And for Beterbiev, it reminded the world why inevitability exists in boxing, not because champions never struggle, but because they endure longer than hope does. Wembley witnessed more than a knockout that night. It witnessed truth. That belief can shake power. Long after the belts were raised and the lights dimmed inside Wembley Arena, this fight continued to echo, not in highlights but in conversations. Because wars like this don't end with a referee's wave. They linger. Artur Beterbiev didn't just leave as a champion that night. He left as a man fully exposed to the truth of his own greatness. He was hurt. He was cut. He was pushed harder than ever before. And instead of breaking, he answered with something deeper than power: resolve. That is the difference between feared champions and historic ones. Anthony Yarde forced that revelation. He forced the champion to dig beneath muscle and momentum, into experience, into patience, into the quiet confidence that only comes from knowing exactly who you are when chaos surrounds you. For Yarde, this fight rewrote his narrative. No longer the talented question mark, no longer the almost fighter. He stood in the center of the fire and didn't step away. He proved that belief, when sharpened by preparation, can carry a fighter further than anyone expects. The boxing world learned something important that night. Artur Beterbiev can be tested, but testing him comes at a brutal cost. And Anthony Yarde learned something just as valuable: that he belongs among the elite, not because he survived, but because he dared to challenge inevitability. This wasn't a fight remembered solely for its ending. It will be remembered for its honesty. Two men stripped of comfort, two wills colliding until only one could continue. That is boxing at its purest. Not records, not predictions, just truth revealed through pain. Years from now, when records blur and titles change hands, this fight will still be spoken about in tones reserved for something rare. Not because it ended in a knockout — boxing is full of those — but because it asked real questions and demanded real answers. The kind of fight where momentum lies to you, where belief feels contagious, where for fleeting moments the impossible seems reachable. Anthony Yarde gave the sport one of those moments. The kind that makes fans stand, breathe differently, and wonder if history is about to bend. And Artur Beterbiev reminded everyone why history is cruel, because it doesn't bend for hope alone. It bends for those who can endure what others cannot. The brilliance of this fight lives in its contradiction. It showed that champions can be shaken without being shattered, that challengers can lose without being diminished, that violence, when paired with heart, creates meaning beyond victory. Beterbiev walked away still unified, still feared, but now fully validated, not just as a destroyer, but as a survivor. Yarde walked away without gold, but with something heavier: credibility forged under fire. This is the kind of fight that defines eras quietly. No slogans, no manufactured hype. Just two fighters meeting at the edge of their limits and refusing to look away. Boxing doesn't always get nights like this. When it does, it remembers them. This fight mattered because it stripped boxing down to its rawest elements. No gimmicks, no shortcuts, just two men walking forward with everything on the line. In an era where narratives are often built before punches are thrown, Beterbiev versus Yarde reminded everyone that truth can only be discovered under pressure. Artur Beterbiev entered as an unstoppable force, a man defined by statistics and fear. He left as something greater, a champion whose dominance had been earned through resistance. Anthony Yarde entered carrying doubts that followed him for years. He left having erased them with blood, grit, and defiance. This was the night he crossed the invisible line between contender and genuine world-class fighter. The significance of this fight lives beyond rankings and rematches. It became a reference point, a reminder to future challengers that belief alone is not enough, but belief combined with discipline, timing, and courage can push even the most feared champions into deep water. And it reminded champions that inevitability is not given, it is defended round by round, exchange by exchange. Wembley Arena didn't just host a title fight that night, it hosted a lesson, one that boxing has taught for generations and will teach for generations more. Greatness is not defined by how easily you win, but by how you respond when winning is no longer guaranteed. What this fight ultimately revealed is the true cost of greatness in boxing, a cost paid not in trophies, but in moments where the body begs and the mind refuses. Artur Beterbiev paid that cost in blood and fatigue, in rounds where his usual certainty cracked just enough to let danger seep in. Anthony Yarde paid it in exhaustion, in courage stretched to its limit, in the slow realization that heart can carry you far, but physics always collects its debt. This was the kind of fight where both men lost something and gained something at the same time. Beterbiev lost the comfort of invincibility, but gained something far more valuable, proof. Proof that when the fight turns ugly, when the script collapses, when power alone isn't enough, he still finds a way. That is the difference between champions who dominate and champions who endure. Yarde, on the other hand, lost the fight but shed the doubts that had clung to him for years, doubts about his stamina. His composure, his willingness to suffer, all of it dissolved under the weight of 8 brutal rounds against one of the most dangerous men of his generation. This was not a defeat that closed doors, it was one that opened them, because boxing remembers fighters who dare to stand when they are supposed to fall. The crowd felt it, the sport felt it, even the champion felt it. When the final shots landed and the corner stepped in, there was no shame in Yarde's posture, only exhaustion earned honestly. And in that moment, boxing did what it does at its best. It told the truth. That legacy isn't always built on wins. Sometimes it's built on resistance. Sometimes it's built on the willingness to walk into hell knowing you might not walk out the same. Beterbiev versus Yarde was a reminder that greatness is never free. It is taken, defended, and paid for in full. When the echoes finally faded and the crowd drifted into the London night, the fight refused to stay behind in the ring. Because bouts like this don't end when the bell sounds, they settle into the sport's memory and refuse to leave. Artur Beterbiev returned to his corner not celebrating, but breathing deeply, marked human, aware that he had just been somewhere unfamiliar. That matters. Champions who are never tested are feared, but champions who are tested and still prevail are remembered. This fight added weight to Beterbiev's legacy in a way another quick knockout never could. It showed that his power is terrifying, yes, but his composure under fire is what truly separates him. For Anthony Yarde, the aftermath was quieter but just as powerful. There was no belt to hold, no official victory to announce, yet something had shifted. Fighters, trainers, and fans saw him differently. He was no longer discussed as potential or athletic promise. He was discussed as a man who had gone into the furnace with one of the most punishing champions of the era and refused to be erased. That kind of performance changes careers. It changes how opponents approach you. It changes how history files your name. This fight also reminded boxing why it still captivates at its best. Because no matter how dominant someone appears on paper, once the gloves are on, certainty dissolves. The ring becomes a place where courage is measured minute by minute, and where reputation must be defended violently. Beterbiev versus Yarde wasn't perfect. It was messy. It was exhausting. It was brutal. And that is exactly why it mattered. It gave the sport something real, a fight where momentum lied, where belief surged, where inevitability wobbled, and where the truth finally landed with concussive force. Long after new champions are crowned and new contenders rise, this fight will remain a reference point. Reminder that boxing's greatest nights are not about dominance alone, but about resistance, heart, and the moments when even the most feared men are forced to prove themselves all over again. There's a specific kind of silence that follows fights like this, not disappointment, not shock, but reflection. The kind where fans don't rush to analyze scorecards or argue hypotheticals, because everyone understands what they've just witnessed. Artur Beterbiev versus Anthony Yarde lived in that space. It wasn't about who was better anymore. That answer was settled. It was about what it takes to stand at the edge of greatness and look over without blinking. Anthony Yarde did that. He didn't borrow confidence from hype or protection from caution. He built it round by round, punch by punch, through moments where lesser fighters would have looked for exits. And yet, boxing's final lesson is always the same. Heart can challenge reality, but it cannot replace it. Beterbiev's pressure was not reckless. He was patient. Every step forward was an investment. Every punch carried memory. He remembered where Yarde breathed harder, where his guard dipped, where exchanges lingered too long. That is how elite champions win wars, not by panicking when threatened, but by trusting that time is their ally. When the end came, it felt sudden only because of how long the struggle had lasted. One moment Yarde was trading, believing, pushing the champion back. The next, gravity took over. And still, even in that moment, Yarde rose. Not because he could win, but because fighters like him need to prove they cannot be dismissed. That is the defining image of this fight. Not the belts raised, not the referee's wave, but the challenger dragging himself up, refusing to surrender his dignity. Boxing respects that above all else. This was not a fight that exposed weakness. It exposed limits, and limits are where truth lives. Beterbiev reached his and pushed through. Yarde reached his and stood in front of it without shame. That is why this fight will be replayed, retold, and referenced, because it wasn't just about who walked away champion. It was about what happens when ambition collides with inevitability and refuses to step aside quietly. Some fights entertain, others educate. This one did both, brutally. Because what Beterbiev versus Yarde ultimately taught is something boxing never explains gently. There are levels not just to skill, but to suffering. Anthony Yarde reached a level that night he had never been to before, not in training, not in previous title attempts. He went past fatigue, past fear, past calculation, and into instinct. That is the space where fighters discover who they really are. And what Yarde discovered was that he could stand with a destroyer, trade with him, hurt him, and force him to adapt. That matters. It changes how a fighter carries himself for the rest of his career. But the fight also reminded everyone why champions like Artur Beterbiev are so rare. Because when instinct takes over, when technique begins to fray, when exhaustion makes cowards of the unprepared, he becomes more dangerous. His pressure isn't frantic, it's deliberate. He doesn't rush endings. He lets them come to him. Every step forward shrinks space. Every exchange tightens the trap. By the time the knockout arrives, it feels less like an explosion and more like gravity finally doing its job. And that's the cruel beauty of this sport. You can do almost everything right and still be overtaken by inevitability. That doesn't erase the effort. It defines it. Yarde's performance didn't fail because he lacked courage or power. He failed because Beterbiev's threshold for pain, patience, and punishment is inhuman. This fight will always stand as a measuring stick, not just for light heavyweights, but for challengers everywhere. It shows what happens when belief meets reality at full speed. Sometimes belief bends reality. Sometimes it simply reveals it more clearly. On that night in Wembley, reality won, but it was forced to work for every second of it. In boxing, that is the highest compliment one fighter can give another. There is a truth in boxing that no record or statistic can ever capture. Legends are forged not in easy victories, but in wars that demand everything from every fighter. Artur Beterbiev versus Anthony Yarde was one of those wars. From the opening bell, the fight felt like a collision between